So we're going to talk about high-fat diets. We're going to talk about ketogenic diets and high-fat diets and high-protein diets and what they do to the microbiome. Um, so I'm a big believer in protein. If you have been in my world for any length of time, you'll know that I speak a lot about getting enough protein in. It is vitally important that we get enough protein in. The studies on this, the research on this is very clear. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon talks a lot about this. I've read a lot of research myself. You must eat ample protein as you age to protect yourself from sarcopenia in order to be strong, right? If you are weight training in order to build muscle, you need to be eating protein. Very, very important. So this is not about lowering the protein that you're eating. It's just about being a little bit more mindful about the fat that you're consuming. And my opinion of this I guess it has changed slightly over the years. I have never been a big proponent of ketogenic diets, ever. You can go back through my Instagram feed and you'll find posts where I warn against the ketogenic diet. So I've never been a proponent for ketogenic diets. I've never been a proponent for carnivore diets. I don't believe that these high-fat, low-carb diets are the answer or are a good idea. But what I have learned in more recent times from mentors, and in particular, I have a mentor who's in the microbiome space. He's a very smart man, and he talks a lot about high-fat diets and saturated fat in particular. And so that has changed my opinion a little bit when it comes to fat. When I started to count my own macros a couple of years ago, and I do not count my macros every single day. I simply cannot do that. And I think it's very interesting to count macros from time to time, because I think it's important to hit certain macros when it comes to protein, even carbohydrates, and also to get an idea of how much fat you're eating. So when I started to track my macros a couple of years back, I realized I was way over consuming fat. And that's really easy to do if you're not conscious of it. And we've come from this whole low fat is bad, so high fat must be good mindset, but that's not true. And I think the pendulum has swung far too far to the other side, from the low fat now to the high fat. So people are just lathering oil on their salads, and they're taking gobs of butter and they're putting it in their coffee, which is not a good idea. I've never said bulletproof coffee is a good idea. And we've just really swung that pendulum too far. And I noticed this with myself, and I was realizing that I definitely was over consuming fat. It's very, very easy to blow out your fat consumption. Think about if you're just snacking on nuts, right? So we have to be mindful. So we're going to dive into why we have to be mindful about fat consumption, specifically as it pertains to gut health. So I understand why women or people in general might go toward more of a keto or carnivore style of eating. It could be because they think it's, for women in particular, midlife women who are starting to notice that they're getting a little bit more weight on their bodies. Perhaps they think that going low carb or high fat is going to support keeping their weight down. Or maybe people have gone to the carnivore diet because they've had really bad gas and bloating. And when you choose a high protein, high fat, low carb diet, you are going to have less gas and less bloating, because you're not going to be making as much hydrogen or methane, because you're not feeding these particular types of microbes in the gut. That's not necessarily a good thing. I believe that these keto carnivore style diets, they're Band-Aid solutions, meaning they're really not solutions at all. Yes, they may alleviate symptoms in the short term, maybe even for quite some time you'll feel better, but ultimately inflammation will increase, and inflation has too, unfortunately, but inflammation will increase over time on these types of diets, and they will create and cause some nasty metabolites to be made in the gut. And metabolites are something we'll talk about, in particular hydrogen sulfide, on this episode. They're not spoken about enough. So we need to start to talk more about metabolites and how we can test these metabolites, because yeah, these types of diets done long term are bad news for gut health. So you're going to end up with these types of diets starving your good bacteria and feeding more of the quote bad bacteria. And this is because you are eating more fat, more protein, which when you eat more fat, you need more bile to digest that fat. And so we have particular microbes in the gut that are bile-loving microbes. And so these microbes are going to come in and gobble up all this bile that you are now generating because of your high-fat diet. And this can be a problem because some of these microbes are quite damaging and they can produce metabolites that can be very damaging. One of them is hydrogen sulfide, which we will talk about in a little bit more detail. And then what can also happen when you're on these high-fat diets is your colon can become more alkaline. We don't want a more alkaline colon, because when we have a more alkaline colon, we can see more pathogenic bacteria can thrive in this environment. Things like C. diff, which I think a lot of people have heard about. So we definitely want to be careful about the pH of the colon and how it can significantly change when we're eating more high fat and less fiber in our diet. So the main issues with these high-fat diets is that they increase the bile, which can increase specific, quote, bad bacteria, in particular these bacteria that feed on the bile. So some of these would be E. coli. Desulfur vibrio is a big one that I see elevated a lot on stool tests. I'll talk to you about how we've moved away from the GI map at this point in time. We're actually utilizing some other types of stool testing. There's a few different types that we utilize now when we work with clients inside the Hormone Balance Solution and in practice. And we can see desulfur vibrio on those stool tests. And we can see another type of bacteria called Bilophila wadsworthia. And the name implies it likes to eat bile, right? Bilophila. And Bilophila wadsworthia and desulfur vibrio, when they're fed up and they're nice and robust, they're going to produce hydrogen sulfide, a metabolite that I keep talking about because it is really important. And I see this a lot. I have a lot of clients who come to us and we run these tests and we see high Bilophila or high desulfur vibrio. And yes, they've been eating more of a low carb, high fat, keto sort of style diet. So we do see this in our ladies' stool tests. And so the other thing that occurs is we lower the diversity when we've got high protein, high fat, because the only way, and I think we all know this by now, our gut should be a very diverse environment. When it comes to bacteria, we want lots and lots of diversity. That's the key. When it comes to gut health, it's all about diversity, which is very different to vaginal health. Vaginal health is not like a diverse microbiome. That should be dominated by lactobacillus, but our gut wants to be nice and diverse. So when you rob the gut and you starve the gut, the good bacteria in your gut, because you're not eating lots of plant foods and diversity of plant foods, which can be tricky, right? So try to, when you go to the supermarket, try to pick up a fruit or a vegetable you haven't eaten before or you don't eat often. I actually have started to go to these organic markets on a Friday with one of my best mates, and I was going around the stalls with her and I saw radishes there. I don't love radishes. They're very bitter, very tangy, but that's so good for you. Bitter foods are so good for you. They're good for your liver. They're good for supporting fluid bile. We love bile. Bile's not the enemy. We just don't want too much of it. And I said to her, I mentioned the radishes and I picked them up, and then she picked them up and we were talking about diversity, and she's now incorporated them into her diet because she said, you know, as much as she eats really healthfully, she was saying that she just always gets the same thing. When she goes to the market, she's been going for years, she just gets the same thing. And so we were sort of chatting about how important diversity of diet is. And it can be tricky. We can get stuck in our ways. I get it. I do too. And I'm trying harder to be more diverse. So after this, I'm going to go and have some radishes. And I'm also going to eat, I like Jerusalem artichokes. I've got some of them in the pantry I'm going to eat. So you want that diversity. You want to be eating lots of different fruits and vegetables to feed the good bacteria. And you're not going to do that on a high-fat keto carnivore style diet. And that's going to then reduce your good bacteria, which Why do we care about good bacteria? Because they produce short chain fatty acids. There's a few different kinds, but one that's really important is called butyrate. Butyrate we see on the new type of stool tests that we run for our ladies. We do see butyrate on those stool tests. And we want butyrate to be about 40% of the microbiome. And we often see butyrate much lower than 40% on our ladies' stool tests. This butyrate is powerfully anti-inflammatory. It actually has a whole host of benefits in the body. It feeds the colon cells, the cells lining our gut. Butyrate feeds them and keeps them nice and healthy. So it can reduce the chance of a leaky gut. It helps stabilize mast cells. Butyrates, it has so many benefits in the body. So you want lots of butyrate, but you're not going to have it if you're not feeding the good bacteria. And we see these good bacteria like bifidobacteria decline on these high-fat ketogenic carnivore style diets. So actually a mentor of mine was saying that 5 days on an animal-based diet saw decreases in short-chain fatty acid bacteria like Roseburia. That's another one that we see on the stool test, like bifidobacteria, Roseburia. Increases in protein putrefactive byproducts like hydrogen sulfide and hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, and slowed transit time by 12 hours, which is huge. So when our ladies come to work with us, we always get them to do a transit time test. Transit time is so important. It tells us a lot about the health of their gut. You can have a fast transit time, you could have a slow transit time, and you don't know what it is unless you do a test. Because even if you are going to the bathroom every single day at the same time and you are having a nice robust poop, you may still have really slow transit time. So you don't want to be fooled into thinking your transit time is perfect because you go to the bathroom every day, because that's not necessarily correct. So when we work with our ladies, we always measure their transit time, and we do it more than once. Once we get them humming on a gut protocol, once we do one of these new stool tests on them, then we get them to redo their transit time tests, maybe a few times over, and that really guides us in how we're supporting them with their gut healing and their gut work. So you don't want to have a slow transit time. You don't want to have a decrease in good bacteria that produce short chain fatty acids. You don't want increases in these byproducts like hydrogen sulfide, because all of these things can contribute to pathology, things like irritable bowel disease or colon cancer and things like this. Increases in not just hydrogen sulfide, by the way, like I said, protein putrefaction metabolites. So they're things like ammonia as well as a hydrogen sulfide. So there are other metabolites as well. And also beta glucuronidase can increase on a high fat, high protein diet. I don't want to say high protein. I don't want you to shy away from protein. You need to get your protein. It's really the fat. It's the fat that we really are concentrating on here. And it's in particular saturated fat, which we'll talk about in a minute. But beta glucuronidase can increase. So beta glucuronidase is something that it's an enzyme that kind of will decouple your toxins or used up estrogen. It decouples these toxins and used up estrogen from what it needs to be coupled, what they need to be coupled with in order, glucuronic acid, in order to, I'm trying to make it more simplistic, in order to be able to be pooped out and eliminated from the system. So if you've got high beta glucuronidase, this enzyme, which the gut plays a big role in whether you'll have high levels or lower levels, and you don't want super low levels, you do not want super high levels. And most women, not most, but what we've seen more is high levels of beta glucuronidase. And this can mean that your toxins or your used up estrogen might get recirculated in your body and not eliminated via your stool. And this can be bad news, because we don't want to have toxic overload. That's very, very dangerous. And we don't want to have used up old estrogen recirculating in our system, because that's also not a healthy thing either. So we don't want that elevated beta glucuronidase. And then these types of diets also increase what we call gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria are bacteria that contain something called LPS, which stands for lipopolysaccharide on their cell wall. And LPS is one of the most inflammatory molecules known to man. Now, these new stool tests that we run, they show the LPS. And it's a reason why I love them so much is we have now this data that we didn't have with the GI map. We have the data on metabolites like hydrogen sulfide and lots of other metabolites as well. And we also have the data on the LPS levels in the gut. And we must make sure that these LPS levels are quite low because they are super duper inflammatory. And, you know, I've said this a lot over the years, but your gut is either contributing to inflammation in your body or actively reducing inflammation in your body. And this is why I bang on about stool testing, and I believe everyone should get a stool test at least once a year. My family and I just did a stool test. There, like I said, we're using a couple of different tests. There's one in Australia that I love. It's a really good one. There's another one in the States. There's a couple in the States. We're about to head over to Canada like we do most years, because if you didn't know, I am actually Canadian. I was born there, raised here, lived over there for 12 years. My husband's Canadian, my kids were born in Canada, and we have a lot of family there. So anyway, we're going to Canada, and it's easier for me to get the North American test, obviously, when I'm in Canada. So we're going to do another one when we get over there, and I'm very excited for this. So I do believe that everybody should do a stool test at least once a year. See what's going on in there. Get a practitioner to create a really good protocol. You are going to do your health and your longevity so much good by just doing a stool test at least once a year and getting a good protocol. Now, that's a story for another day. We've changed, I've gone off course here a little. We'll circle back to the fat, but we've changed a lot of the ways that we work in practice. As when you learn better, you do better, right? And I am constantly learning. I'm constantly signing up to really good quality mentorships. And I've recently done a certification and got a new certification. I'm about to do the advanced level of that certification under the mentorship of one of the world's most renowned microbiome experts, who's also a clinician. And I had known for a while that essential oils, such as the oil of oregano that you can get, everybody has it, has used it, right? The capsules. Essential oils can be quite damaging to the microbiome. So we no longer utilize the actual essential oils. We utilize tinctures, which are more gentle on the microbiome. So we've made a couple of shifts. We don't use berberine anymore because the research that this particular mentor of mine, he did his PhD in I'm not sure whether it was actually in berberine, but in his PhD, he looked into berberine, and the research on berberine was actually quite concerning on what it does to the microbiome in just 2 weeks of use. So when you do this stool test, you want to be working with practitioners who have the most up-to-date knowledge of the microbiome, because the microbiome research is relatively in its infancy. I think that we know a hell of a lot more than we did even 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And that research is constantly evolving. So you must work with a practitioner who has their finger on the pulse, who has mentors, at least in the industry, who are constantly revising their knowledge and updating the way that they do things. So that's my little rant. All right. So back to high-fat diets. The other thing that high-fat diets can do is they can cause what we call endotoxemia. So basically, when you eat a meal, and there are studies on this, when you eat a meal that is high in fat, then you get a flood of endotoxins into your system. And this generates systemic full body inflammation. And this is what we actually term postprandial endotoxemia. Postprandial meaning after a meal. So you eat this high fat meal and you get this flood of endotoxins into your system, and you then generate a lot of inflammation. And the higher the fat content in the meal, the higher the serum levels of endotoxins will be in your body. And it's particularly saturated fat that enhances this endotoxin absorption, whereas things like omega-3s will attenuate this response to a high-fat meal. So, you know, perhaps taking a fish oil supplement might be a good idea if you're having a high-fat meal. We love fish oil supplements. We particularly like Zinzino. That's one of the fish oils that we utilize a lot with our ladies, but omega-3s will attenuate this response to a high-fat meal, as will fruit or fiber. Because there was a particular study, and I'll try to link to it in the show notes. I think it was done with McDonald's, and they gave the participants a McDonald's meal, and then I believe they gave them 30 grams of apples. Anyway, don't quote me on this, but I'll see if I can find the study. And anyway, the 30 grams of the fruit did attenuate the endotoxemia that these people saw quite significantly as well. Well, attenuated it, right? And it would just a little bit of fruit, 30 grams. So that's a fun fact. If you are going to eat a high fat meal, and I'm not going to not have a burger from time to time. I love burgers, but if you just have a little bit of fruit with it, and maybe a couple of omega-3 fish oil capsules, you can attenuate that response, that endotoxemia, that inflammatory response. So I think that's pretty cool. And so it is saturated fats in particular that contribute to this. Dairy fats are quite problematic when eaten in excess. We don't see these types of issues or these types of blooms of the quote bad bacteria in when things like extra virgin olive oil are consumed. So it is really that saturated fat, and in particular dairy fats, that contribute to these issues the most. So that is a big fat no to bulletproof coffee. Please don't drink bulletproof coffee. Never been a proponent. Never liked it myself. I don't know, perhaps I tried it once, I can't recall, but it's not my thing. But I've never suggested it. I do not think that's a good idea for anybody. So that's a big fat no to bulletproof coffee. I think it's a big fat no to coconut oil from the jar. And again, this is one thing that, I've definitely over the years changed my tune on, is those really high fat, like those fat bombs that we all used to have, made out of coconut oil. Or people used to advocate for eating spoonfuls of coconut oil from the jar. I think I even used to. But again, when you learn more, you do better. So no more eating fat bombs, or at least not at least not regularly. I am not for restriction. I am not somebody who absolutely always eats perfectly, not at all. But you just want to be mindful of these things, and perhaps you make a few little switches. For example, I was talking to a hormone balance solution lady today, and I was asking her, because she did have a little bit of high dissolved Vibrio, and I was asking her about her diet and her fat intake. And she was telling me she uses coconut oil. And I said, well, here's just a simple switch. No more coconut oil. Instead, use extra virgin olive oil, because we're not going to see the blooms of the quote bad bacteria with the extra virgin olive oil like we do with the coconut oil. And also somebody asked me today as well, what did I think of MCT oil? This is another hormone balance solution lady. And she said to me, what do I think of MCT oil? And I've changed my tune on that one too. I just don't think it's necessary. I used to suggest MCT oil to clients in particular because I had learned it could potentially increase secretory IgA, which is an immune marker in the gut. I never saw it clinically work though. And, seldom do we see something like that occur, whereby you're consuming a particular food and you're seeing this marker change dramatically. So I no longer suggest MCT oil. I don't think it's required or necessary. We get enough fat from our diet without adding coconut oil to our coffee or MCT oil to our diets, right? So let's circle now back to hydrogen sulfide metabolite, because this is one that we see a lot, comes up a lot, and you may have high hydrogen sulfide. So let's talk about what this might look like, what symptoms you might have if you have high hydrogen sulfide. So you might have belching, right? Burping. You might have gas, flatulence. Specifically, you might have rotten egg gas. It's not always rotten egg gas, but if you do have rotten egg gas, there's a very high chance you've got some high hydrogen sulfide production in your gut, and you really need to do a stool test to figure out which bacteria are contributing to that. Perhaps nausea, diarrhea or constipation, body pain or joint pain, aches and pains, and also bladder pain as well. So those are some of the symptoms of excess hydrogen sulfide. Now, hydrogen sulfide is not a bad thing. It's not just outrightly bad. It can be bad and good, but it's that balance that you want. So you don't want too much. When you have too much, you don't want too little either. But when you have too much, that's when you're going to start to get these symptoms. Now, hydrogen sulfide is involved in inflammation in the body, right? So it's going to help with that inflammation, or it's going to help or hinder it. It's involved in gut motilities, that transit time I was talking to you about, oxidative stress, vascular tone, neuromodulation, memory formation, hormone secretion, apoptosis. It's involved in ulcerative colitis. And I was saying this before, so irritable bowel disease, it is involved in disease pathology when too high, and that includes things like irritable bowel disease, like ulcerative colitis, colon cancer, Parkinson's. It can also play a role in DNA damage, and when it's too high, it can inhibit mitochondrial function, and those are the energy houses in our cells, the energy powerhouses in our cells. And just remember, like hydrogen sulfide, like I've said, it's one issue. It's really about the whole diversity of the gut. It's about the other metabolites as well. But that is one that we do see quite frequently. And I spoke to you about LPS as well. We see that on these new stool tests as well. So I hope that was helpful in maybe opening your eyes a little bit as to why these ketogenic diets, these high fat, low carb diets, carnivore diets done long term are probably not a good idea. I'm not saying that they definitely have no merit ever, but in the world that I work in, with the women who I work with, they don't. And it's not something that I recommend for my ladies. And perhaps research will change, and I will have my finger on the pulse of that, and I am not afraid to change the way I do stuff, because I will always bring my audience and my clients the best research that we have, and things change all the time. But I'm pretty confident in saying that high fat diets are not the answer, and they're going to do your microbiome harm. So they're probably something to steer clear of. If you are struggling with your weight or your mood or other things, you might want to explore on a deeper root cause level what's going on there, because it's not because your diet has too many fruits and vegetables in it. So I hope that was helpful, and we will speak again soon. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed and that you're following me on Instagram. I'm at Tara Thorne Health. I would also be forever grateful if you'd leave me a 5-star review, because this helps the podcast reach more women who need this information. And if you're interested in working with me, check the show notes for more information about how you can do that. I look forward to connecting with you again soon. I am not a medical professional, and the information provided in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. I do not have access to your individual medical history or circumstances, so the content discussed here should not be considered as medical advice. Before making any changes to your diet, lifestyle, or considering the use of supplements, please consult with a qualified healthcare professional or your doctor to ensure it's safe and appropriate for your specific situation. Any decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are at your own discretion and risk. Thank you for tuning in.